interest. I'm Gabriela Patram. We're so happy that you can join us today. Joining the discussion today is former President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and leader of the People's National Congress Reform, Mr. David Granger. Sir, welcome. It's always a pleasure to have you on the program.
It's always a pleasure to be on your program, Gabby. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sir, I want us to continue discussing today the current flood situation in Guyana. I am subject here to your correction. I think we're heading into probably about 50 days into this natural disaster. Would that timing be correct to your knowledge
Yes, it's
too?
about right, I think. Yes.
About that, okay. Sir, my first question is, this administration on 5th of June would have admitted to that this is the first or the worst natural disaster in its history, only on the 5th of June. Why did it take so long to acknowledge that?
It is a fact that from about the 26th of April, rainfall clearly was abnormal in volume and also in extent. And things have not really gotten better, and by my calculation, it's been about 7 weeks of extraordinary rainfall. It's a good question why it took so long, and it took nearly 6 weeks for the first announcement to be made, acknowledging that this was a disaster. That word was introduced by the administration itself, that this was Guyana's worst natural disaster. And you would wonder why something so grave, so serious, took so long to be acknowledged. I can only assume that people were ignorant of the impact of climate change and ignorant about what is taking place around the country. In this regard, I feel that we need to look at the communications deficit again, because most of the media houses are located in Georgetown or on the coast. And if you have a countrywide disaster, it meant that many of the media houses did not have access to that information or were not reporting that information. And in fact, not only the government, perhaps other people might have been subject to this lack of information. But the government was certainly slow in acknowledging that the flood had reached disastrous proportions. But it was clear from my own contact with my members of parliament and persons in all of the regions, Region 10, Region 7, Region 1, Region 2, that the situation had already been a disaster maybe 2 or 3 weeks into the flood, certainly in May. And it was bizarre that the government was not aware of what is taking place in the country. I want to point out that my coalition had started to establish regional public broadcasting stations. So we had a station in Bartica, in Lethem, in Madia, in Mabaruma, in Aishalta, and Oriala. The idea was that in the event of a disaster, this is a disaster, in the event of a disaster, information should be passed quickly from village to center and from each regional town to Georgetown. And if this were happening, if the present administration were making use of our regional public broadcasting service, they would have been aware of the gravity of the flood much earlier. So I could only suggest that it was ignorance, pure ignorance, that lulled them into this state of apathy, or in which they were not taking any action at all. But it was well known in all of the regions. My MPs knew that, it was being reported, and the government was ignoring the disaster. It kept getting worse. Perhaps they were hoping that it would get better, but they were disappointed. It's getting worse, and it is still very bad all over the country.
And sir, a couple of days after the 5th of June, coming around the June 9th or so, the CDC advised that the countrywide flooding would have reached a level 2 disaster. Any idea what would have caused the delay in declaring that as well?
The declaration by the government or the acceptance of the CDC recommendation was important because, one, the whole country knew, and the international community knew, CARICOM knew, that it's like cancer. When you have, stage 2 cancer, you know that, the disease is going in one direction. And if you have a level 2 disaster, it was a signal to the international community that although the national government could respond, they would need international assistance. So it was a trigger for the PPP government to seek assistance internationally. I cannot say whether they waited for that declaration or if they could have made that declaration earlier, but it meant that although the government was not overwhelmed, it needed assistance to cope with the impact of the flood. So the declaration took a long time to come. I reckon it was about 4 days. It could have come earlier, or the government could have responded earlier, but it didn't. But once that declaration of a level 2 disaster was made, it empowered the administration, or it enabled the administration to seek international assistance. And it was almost like, look, we have proof that we're not in a normal situation, and we need assistance. And that did trigger help from various sources, as you know. But it could have been done earlier, or we could even have avoided it if the government had responded to the crisis earlier in May. But it didn't. It waited 4 days. And the CDC announcement was just a confirmation of the gravity of the flood.
And sir, like you mentioned, in any disaster, people need assistance, they need help. And this administration would have sought parliamentary approval for the expenditure of $10 billion to respond to the flood on June 10. How do you expect that this money will be spent or dispersed?
I don't know if anybody could answer that question, quite frankly, because there's no plan. There has been no assessment. We know that later on, CARICOM did send a team from SIDEMA to do an assessment. But after 7 weeks, the government should have been able to come up with its own plan, with its own assessment, to determine what its priorities were. We heard that, some money has to go to the farmers, some money has to go to the miners, but we don't know how much will be spent on infrastructural changes, to remove the floodwaters. We don't know how much will be spent on relief. We don't know how much will be spent on recovery, how much will be spent on compensation. In my view, having spoken with my MPs, very little information was provided at the time of that request. It did not seem as if a plan had been presented to the National Assembly or been presented to the people of Guyana, and nobody is quite sure how that amount of money will be spent. If it will be spent properly, if it will be spent on acquiring equipment, if it will be spent on food stuff, nobody knows for sure. Frankly, we need to look at the disaster in several phases. Definitely, people who are suffering, and a lot of people are suffering. People are without food, people cannot plant, people cannot leave their homes. Farmers who cultivate crops for subsistence purposes, for their own household use, have not been able to go to those farms. And we don't know exactly what the government intends to do. And at the end of it, we don't know if we'll be better off, because in 5 months' time, the December rains will be upon us. The December rains will be upon us, and if we do not have an exit strategy, if we do not have a plan to provide the infrastructural changes which are necessary in this short period, things could be worse next time. And we need to look at remedies, not just relief. We need to look at remedies. We need to, even at this time, develop an inclusive approach to solving the problem. Everybody's coming up with, with short-term plans, and we need an inclusive. Let us get the best Guyanese brains. Let us see the opposition and the government working together to get out of this disaster. It was the government's own words said this is Guyana's greatest national disaster. It is not a one-man show. It is not for a Lone Ranger. We need Guyanese with the ability, with the intelligence to sit down and plan an exit from this terrible disaster. And I don't see it happening. I don't see that the budget has made any provision for intelligent expenditure of this huge sum of money.
Sir, I just want to let us talk a little bit, coming back to your point where you mentioned the government not being able to put together their own report, because the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency would have presented its preliminary detailed damage sector analysis report on the 30th of June to Prime Minister. Why did this administration wait for over 2 months after the flooding began for a report about the disaster?
The difference between the Guyana government and the government of the Caribbean community is that the Caribbean community in general expects hurricanes every year. There's a hurricane season. So CDEMA, the Caribbean the Disaster Emergency Management Agency, is a permanent institution equipped to deal with disasters every year. It is not an ad hoc agency, and we have to compare our own preparedness with what happens in the Caribbean. And the fact that we had to appeal to the Caribbean for assistance suggests that there are certain inadequacies or a lack of organization in Guyana to deal with what has now become recurrent. Because when we listen to the people on the ground, they are saying that every year there is a flood, but this is worse than before. So what we need, therefore, is to set up our own. The CDC is not adequate. We know that they try hard. Everybody is full of praise for Colonel Craig and what they've been doing. It is not enough. This is a whole of country problem, and there must be some review of the disaster management apparatus in this country. For one, we don't know which minister is in charge. We know one day the Prime Minister is opening a stamp exhibition, another day he's handing out hampers, another day he's doing some information technology. But this disaster requires a hands-on approach. And that person with the hands-on is not Colonel Craig from the CDC. There has got to be a different type of organization. And we have to have the ability to do our own assessments. Now, everybody welcomes the Caribbean, the CDEMA team, but reading the reports, it's full of generalities, It is not a very deep report. Of course, they spent a very short time on the ground, and it was only a preliminary report. This requires an in-depth study because Guyana, if you put all of the Anglophone Caribbean countries together, they are not as big as Guyana. So the plans of small island states, which may be excellent, cannot compare to the type of plan the Republic of Guyana needs. We are more than twice the size of all of the Caribbean countries together. And we need to have a different approach to planning. So CDEMA, we thank them, we appreciate the contribution they've made, but we need to take disaster planning much more seriously. and we need to set up a structure which could protect our people. Now, when you see flooding in the Rupununi, or flooding in the Kokwani area, or flooding in the northwest, they're not all caused by the same phenomena. The Rupununi is influenced heavily by what takes place in the Amazon, and the riverine areas are the areas where most of the harshest impact has been found. For example, in Kokwani, near the Borbis River, Akowini, near the Pomeroon River, and up to now, I think Maracaibo, up to quite recently, the Tushao Maracaibo spoke about, the plight of the indigenous people in that community in Region 5. Some people have not been able to leave their homes for 2 or 3 weeks. So we need to have a better plan. Disaster planning is not one size fits all. And people know what happens in the Caribbean. We need to make a detailed study. And this administration has had the time, and there are plans. There are plans for communication, there are plans for investigation, there are plans for setting up warehouses in all of the regions. This administration, this PPP, believes in centralization. My government, my coalition, introduced the concept of regionalization. That's why we have capital towns at Mabaruma, Bartica, Mahdia, and Lethem. So each town must be the center of disaster management. It must have its own warehouses, it must have its own personnel, it must have a company of the militia, a volunteer company of the militia, which can assist the authorities. This flood is regional. All 10 regions are affected, and you cannot have a single minister or a single CDC effectively managing the emergency that is upon us. We've got it all wrong, and if anything, I hope that this disaster would be a lesson for the administration, that it has to be more inclusionary and it has to revisit its whole approach to handling disaster.
So my next question to you is seeing a lot of social media commentary and also correspondences back and forth, which is the acceptance of assistance from Trinidad and Tobago. The administration would have sought international assistance but declined assistance from Trinidad and Tobago, to be more specific, on the 25th of June. So what lessons can we learn from these requests and responses?
Trinidad and Tobago is one of the most developed Caribbean countries, and my information is that it only responded to a request that came to it through the Caribbean Community Secretariat or through SIDEMA. Normally, these requests are not done on a bilateral basis.
Okay.
SIDEMA is very experienced, CARICOM Secretariat is very experienced, they've handled disasters before. It is my belief, unless I'm otherwise informed, it is my belief that Trinidad and Tobago was properly advised and went about preparing relief that was requested. When you listen to the people on the ground in Guyana, when you listen to Tushao John from Maracaibo, when you listen to people in Akowini, people, in the Pomeroon, individual persons are suffering. People need food, they need water. This government cannot tell the people of Guyana, we've got that covered. It is not covered. It is not covered at all. People need food, they need fresh water, they need tentage, they need shelter. And it is wrong to deny the people the relief that was promised by Trinidad and Tobago. Yes, we need pumps as well. But today, tonight, tomorrow, we need food, we need shelter. And people are not getting that. I cannot understand why, the government should have turned it down, even though they would have needed some additional, or even though they do have need for equipment, infrastructure development, and so on. There's no reason, there's no good reason why the people of this country should have been denied food that they need in an emergency. When a flood strikes, when a fire strikes, you need relief within 24 hours. And now we're here 7 weeks, and some people have not received relief. Recovery will be more difficult. It will take much longer. But I think this has been a travesty on top of a tragedy.
And sir, on that note, if we can look at the human aspect of it more in depth, or the human suffering, the Civil Defense Commission estimated approximately 51,000 households are being affected by this disaster. What will be the cost in human suffering of this disaster, sir?
Well, the cost so far is untold. I don't know that the government has embarked on any means of finding out or measuring what you call human suffering. It is impossible to imagine, 1/3 of our population. If you're talking about 51,000 households, you're talking about 250,000 Guyanese who have been affected. Don't worry about what you see around the city. Worry about the people who live in villages, and most Guyanese live in villages, in rural or hinterland areas. And if by CDC's assessment there are the disasters affected 51,000 households, you're talking about 250,000 people. So that's the size of the problem. Many of the people out of town live by farming or live on farm produce, almost on a day-to-day basis. And if the farms are flooded, it means that they have no food. Children cannot go to school. It means that, they have no fresh water. It means that they probably don't have anywhere comfortable to sleep at night. It means that there's, discomfort, not for a day or two, but for several weeks at a time. So the human impact, is almost immeasurable. And I don't think the government has attempted to calculate, how families are affected. They've gone to certain areas, but this is a whole of country disaster. Furthermore, when we're talking about the behavior of people in the countryside, particularly, or the impact on people in the countryside, you're talking about various age groups. You're talking about young mothers with babies. You're talking about, older folk, who cannot cope with flooding, as maybe younger folk. It's not a matter of playing in flood and it goes down after, a day or two of rainfall. This is something that's been going on for, 50 days. And people have to be suffering from what I read in the papers, from the reports I get from my MPs. Very little attention has been paid to some communities. Unfortunately, at the start of the disaster, the administration seemed to be putting a lot of emphasis on what they call the red villages, and they were ignoring the green villages, where it felt that their supporters did not live. And that has caused a problem because, hunger doesn't have colors, red village and green village. Everybody's hungry. And the impact is many-sided. We have not received reports about medical impact, about waterborne diseases. Again, the government is practicing a well-rehearsed theory of normalizing. All things are normal. There are no waterborne diseases to speak of. This is incredible that some areas have been flooded for 7 weeks, and there's no diarrhea, there's no cholera, there's no dysentery, there's no gastroenteritis. This is amazing, but I think it's too good to be true. And if the truth be told, I think it'll be found that the human impact is measurable not only in loss of earnings, loss of production, but also poorer health and and human suffering. It is a very bad case. It is the worst disaster we've ever had. So I would say that, being confined in houses, I would say that there might be a psychological problem as well. People who have been locked in involuntarily for such a long time. And this is an occasion in which, I would say that the government needs to immediately convene an independent commission of inquiry into this disaster. Let us not depend on SIDEMA, which might give you the statistics, facts and figures. Particularly answering your question, let us have a commission of inquiry so that we can look at the impact on individuals, on families. It must be independent, it must be impartial. That we don't just want a few government servants or a few government ministers to go out there and ask questions. We want a real commission of inquiry so that we can look at the long-term resolution of flooding in this country. And we want to have it soon. It should be convened now. We've already been under flood warning since the 26th of April, and we must aim to get a report, by August, so that we are better prepared for the December rains. There will be more floods, and there will be more rains, and there will be more suffering if we don't get this right. All I can say at this point in time that the government must convene immediately an impartial and independent inquiry into this disaster.
Right. Well, sir, thank you very much for being with me on the program. It's always a pleasure. To you, our viewers, we say thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Public Interest. On behalf of all of us here, we would like to continue to encourage you to follow all COVID-19 guidelines. Goodbye.